have to push it. Oh, yeah, technology. Yes. Good evening, everybody. And I know you're tired. And Chambi, Nabari. Yeah, I know you're tired. It's our last session for today. We're going to wait for colleagues to come through. There's been changes in the program, and we're going to announce those changes. But we'll give them another 5 to 10 minutes, since everything's been closed from what I've been told, so that we can all be in the plenary. So just bear with us, please. Thank you. So we'll wait for the others. Ok, bonsoir, bonsoir. Elie, nous allons commencer. Et merci beaucoup. Hola. Obrigado. Great. Thank you for coming back. Yes, I have to thank people for coming back because so many people left. So thank you for your commitment. Whatever brought you back, I hope it was Toussaint who brought you back. Toussaint, mon président. Yeah. You know, we respect our presidents where we come from, you know, very highly. So this evening, we have the privilege of listening to my president, our president, le Père Toussaint, but he's also Professor Toussaint Kafahire Mohula, who is president of the association and our very dynamic president. We always tell him that no one else could lead such a difficult and complicated group than him. So we're always grateful, you know, for his work. Toussaint has been with ASA for so many years and through this journey, and we are really grateful for the work that he does, and I think everybody sees that. Toussaint is a Jesuit priest, being somebody who also grew up in the Catholic Church. I take priests very seriously, and somebody whose mother insisted he should become a priest. I'm glad when others did. So he's a Jesuit priest, he's an educator, he's a theologian, and also a professor of political science. He has lectured in many countries, in the DRC, Kenya, Ghana, in Hungary, the US, and in Japan. He is going to speak to us today on something that relates also to something special that he has, which is also philosophy, which he graduated from in 1998, and theology in 2003. And amongst the many places that he has been to, I know that he always speaks about part of his alma mater, Loyola University in Chicago, which he holds very specially in his heart. But his research is really on international relations and global politics, global health, social justice, and questions around ethical leadership and society and democracy in African countries. He also does stuff on literature, the hermeneutics, and also post-colonial theory. He is the executive director of the Centre Européen pour la Recherche et la Formation, which is CAF, in Lumumbashi, and CAF hosted us in 2023. It was a very beautiful conference. It was very difficult to get there, but once you were there, you had a good time, and then it was very difficult to leave. You know? But we're very grateful that he hosted us, and today he's decided to speak to us, honoring Valentin Mudimbe, was one of his mentors. And the title of his talk is The African Studies Yesterday and Today Between Humanity, Stewardship, and Ecological Externalities. Oh, floor is yours, man. Merci, Toussaint.
Voilà, good evening. Good evening. I think we are tired, and I know that we want to see the day over, but you will suffer a little bit more that I go through this paper with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Divine, for those kind words of introduction. Indeed, I wanted to just remember Professor Valentin Yves Moudimbe, that many of you may know of or be familiar with his work, who passed away in April this year. And as I said in the morning, actually, another giant from the African studies as well, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, also left us to join our ancestors. That was back in May, I believe, the same year. So 2025 has been quite a year. But when giants of that, nature, I would say, depart, it means that we are called to continue their work. The part of Africa I come from, especially Eastern Congo, when an elder dies, we don't do a mourning. What we do, symbolic gestures, is to take a hoe, go to their field, and try to cultivate again so that we show there will be continuity of what they were doing. To come back to my presentation this evening, I'm going to try not to follow my pages, maybe, and try to shorten it. But Divine mentioned that the title is The African Studies Yesterday and Today, Between Ecological Externalities and Humanities Stewardship. He mentioned I'm a Jesuit priest. The humanities stewardship in the title, actually, if you want me to explain that, is simply to say that I am my brothers and my sisters' keeper, which sometimes we tend to forget. And when we look at how politics is being conducted on the African continent, we begin to wonder really what's wrong with us. The idea of ecological externalities, I will be explaining it, is also to say we live in a time where or when a handful of people actually try or tend to monopolize the gain, the profit, the money, the resources, and everything else, but they dump on the rest of us, I mean the majority of the people, all the consequences, especially negative consequences. And so we need to question how are we approaching these issues. And this morning, I believe, when Christina Duarte was talking and challenging the African studies or the studies, academic studies in general, she said we have to make our research relevant. And that relevance or relevancy will be how our production of knowledge is effectively changing lives and affecting the communities where we live and from where we try to think. So a quick introduction is to simply recognize that we convened this 6th biennial conference not solely to identify global vulnerabilities that affect our lives in Africa and elsewhere, but also to imagine a future filled with hope, shaped by Africans whose ingenuity and resilience are still waiting to be harnessed. As I said, this morning we received insights from Carlos Lopez and Christina Duarte's presentation regarding the peril of allowing others to define our problems for us and proposing solutions to these problems. So the way they will frame the problems may not necessarily solve or resolve our issues. It will work to protect and promote their interests. This is the very essence of colonialism that infantilized Africans by explaining what they needed and providing for it. Speaking on behalf of others is taking away their power to narrate their own stories. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur has written a book called Le Juste. He has many books, but I just refer to this particular book called Le Juste, which underscores the possibility of speaking on oneself, narrating one's own story as the sine qua non condition for being a subject of justice. The moment we take ownership And I was very happy to hear this morning also that when Christina was talking, saying when we talk about sovereignty, it has also to concern the sovereignty of language, of discourse, what we are talking about, how we are defining the issues. So consequently, we must understand vulnerability within the context of our today's discourse, which pertains to susceptibility to harm or the potential to suffer damage. And this is related to the externalities of the neoliberal time. The starting observation that I am making, therefore, is to acknowledge the harm and injuries and traumas and injustices and griefs that African peoples have endured throughout history as a result of global decision. These vulnerabilities are pervasive across the continent. They are structural. They have persisted for nearly 65 years since independence. And of course, we can go back during the colonial days. Actually, they come from the worldwide system of capitalism that has assigned Africa a painful role to play in the world, to be a reservoir of misfortunes, raw materials, and safaris. I believe it is Chinua Achebe who, in one of the interviews he was giving, say that it is really, really easy for the West to portray Africa in harsh lights, because that makes it palatable for the policies that they do provide to resolve some of these African issues. So it is a strategy also of perpetuating the system or the structures that have been put in place. So this observation from an external perspective gives us not only the possibility of understanding the externalities we suffer, but also constitute a particular image of Africa that will recycle and regenerate through uncritical production of knowledge from what Professor Mudimbe said or called the colonial library. In Africa, characterized by political instability, chronic poverty, endemic corruption, unending conflicts. This Africa of poverty and unemployment is a construction that legitimizes a system of foreign aid to camouflage Western exploitation. Thus, in the face of global crises such as pandemics, remember the COVID-19, which is close to us, or maybe the Ebola or HIV and AIDS, there is always a Western portrayal of Africa that projects expectations and establishes prescriptions on behalf of political philanthropy, which is not philanthropy per se. It is rather politics. The most fundamental form of global vulnerability toward Africa, therefore, resides in the denial of Africans to define their own problems, but also the denial of Africans' humanity. A negative self-image that results from that denial has also persisted as a psychological consequence. It has compelled foreigners to commodify the whole of the continent of Africa, but also its people. So what moral compass are we using in diagnosing Africa's ills? I believe it is essential to diagnose the situation accurately. In his discourse on colonialism, Martinican poet, statesman, and one of the founders of the Negritude movement, Aimé Césaire, argues that the main issue is to be dupe in good faith of a collective hypocrisy that cleverly misrepresents problems to legitimize better the hateful solutions provided for them. So the kind of epistemological violence that ensues from such a system and inflicted upon the African continent is, of course, one form of historical and academic injustices that scholars seldom examine. Yet, misrepresentations of Africans and black people in general everywhere around the world have produced far-reaching effects, which we know resulted in the recent wave of police brutalities in the US. You will remember the humiliation of African heads of states in international spaces, and the language of naming given African states shithole countries or nations without fear of outrage or protest. Embedded in the modern collective consciousness is the belief that black lives are less valuable, if valued at all. Additionally, Africa as a geographic locus of black people has remained an exotic space that can be explored for safaris and exploited for minerals to satisfy the curiosity of science, which is predominantly controlled by the West. This mindset has led to the infliction of ecological and environmental externalities that also call for justice and reparation. A modern term in political language highlights the environmental harm caused in the name of science and technology, which has justified the subsequent sacrifice of Africa as just a collateral damage for progress. This way of thinking is, of course, unacceptable when it comes to valuing human lives globally and within various groups. Additionally, the idea of tolerating collateral damage, accepting current suffering for future gains. As you will remember, the slogan about globalization in the early 90s was telling us, mirrors the neoliberal rhetoric that forced structural adjustment programs on Africa to seize its social safety nets. If political scientists paid attention to the significance and impact of words, as Professor Lina Ben Abdallah suggests, they would recognize the need to acknowledge their discipline's explicit and implicit epistemological violence. Hence, in this reflection, I propose what the quote from Aimé Césaire calls us to pause for a while and take the measure of what it means to be critical minds. It suggests not taking political philanthropy, for instance, at face value. It reminds us that African studies have a vocation to be critical, and when addressing issues such as the exploitation of the African environment or minerals and the value of African lives, it is crucial to remember the very problematic of measurement. I think I gain my insight from scholars I had the chance to meet, and those who know me, those who have been around me, they know that I value very, very much the wisdom of elders, and I believe we simply need to be able to, especially as Africans, to sit down and listen to what elders have to teach us from their personal lives and experiences. And so during my PhD research, I think, I spent a few months in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University, and there I met an Irish Jesuit, professor of philosophy of science. Divine said I was going to speak from a philosophical perspective, but in many of the sharings and exchanges that I had with Patrick Hillen, who had done first a PhD in physics, nuclear physics, then went back to earn another PhD in philosophy of science under some great Nobel Prizes in the sciences. And what I learned from Patrick Hillen was simply to remind me that every time we approach any scientific issue, we really need to put it in context. The system of thinking may vary depending whether we are maybe using mathematics or the social sciences, and we cannot extrapolate the meaning to believe that this is something that is going to be universal for everyone and everywhere. So allow me to reminisce about something which I call, Plato's myth of the cave. I wonder what makes reality in Africa real, or reality indeed. I will illustrate what has been mentioned above and avoid discussing Africa in general. Everyone is following the rhetoric about climate change, of course, or energy transition, and the rush for the remaining critical resources. But when you live in Africa and when you know that electricity is still a problem on a daily basis, we begin to wonder, this energy transition is for who? Or the green transition affects whose lives? The competition among technologically advanced nations has resumed, and scientific progress again serves to justify exploring Mars, the planet, or the ocean floors for access to minerals. Despite my understanding of colonial history, I remain seriously puzzled by the attitude I see personally in my home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, among academics and scholars, and of course by extension in other African countries. It looks like we easily mortgage the future of our own children for quick gains in monetary nature. I use the DRC as an example which can be applied to the rest of Africa, considering recent political developments, say in Sudan or South Sudan, in Mali or Burkina Faso, in Central African Republic, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Niger, among other countries. Our communities are being decimated. Our populations are being displaced, all for access to raw materials. As a priest, I spent some field work, like some time, on the field, and I went to visit some internally displaced people's camps. And these are people who used to have homes and to lead a normal life, but because a small group of rebels, whether you call them M23 or other names, decide that they want to have access to the resources, they would send millions of people to live in very critical conditions, subhuman, because they expect impunity, unfortunately. So over the last 30 years, Rwanda has acted as the armed hand of the West in Eastern Congo, killing with impunity for the sake of minerals. Recently, I was at the European Union Parliament, in Brussels, discussing some of the decisions of foreign aid attributed to the Rwandan government in ways of armaments, and showing that the M23 movement that really is fighting in Eastern Congo is the Rwandan army sent across borders, and the EU continue to fund regardless of how much pain and suffering is inflicted on people. I thought maybe all the rhetoric about exporting democracy, promoting human rights is just that which MSZ calls a collective hypocrisy. Of course, I could clarify this point with an aphorism I learned from my political science professors in Chicago, saying where you stand depends on where you sit. And indeed, The reading we make of social realities will depend on who we are, who we know, and what are the interests that we are trying to protect and promote. So coming back to the externalities and the human stewardship, as mentioned in my presentation's title, this refers to the negative consequences of pursuing short-term gains at the expense of justice, at the expense of truth, at the expense of sustainable peace. I will argue, therefore, that this complicity of the silence that we may find in our studies present a significant challenge to who we claim to be or to the gatherings that we try to host and organize. My main question is about what are we missing, what we are missing in our perception of today. A philosopher, again, excuse me to refer a lot to philosophers, but Michel Foucault has a very wonderful piece which is called What is Today? And in this piece, Michel Foucault, the way he just explained also what is enlightenment, not by providing, a straightforward definition, but by saying what it is not, is something also you find in the discourse on colonialism. When MSSL begins to define what is colonialism, he tells us first what it is not. And he says this is not Christian philanthropy. This is not about civilization. It is everything else but what people claim it to be. So here I say Plato's allegory of the cave comes to mind, offering a powerful analogy and framework. Hence, my question, does the current political ecology leave us vulnerable to the structures of global neoliberal culture? Takes on a deep meaning. Is the system constructed to distort our ability to see clearly, to think critically about who we really are as human beings? Coming back to this discourse on colonialism, let us not accept that our problem be misrepresented, because a wrong diagnosis made to an illness is the only cause, sure cause of death of the patient. Our understanding of the African condition, therefore, will only be limited when we focus solely on surface level issues and fail to explore the deeper causes that shape the continent's reality. Perhaps we are daunted by the work of thinking critically about the fundamental questions to the extent that any call for change of minds or paradigm shifts remind us of how politics always crushes intellectual dreamers. However, interpreting our condition, our condition africaine, our African condition, is a task that African scholars and Africanist scholars in the African studies cannot tire of doing unless we acknowledge that foreign vested interest, mercenary philanthropy, and other discursive distortions conceal the truth about what's been going on for ages. At the same time, our lands will continue to be plundered, conflicts will continue to erupt, wars will continue to be fought, and climate harshness will continue to decimate our people who unfortunately are not protected by the governments that we do have in place. And so ecological externalities here concern not only climate change, as I was saying, as a global problem, or as it is usually conceptualized from the perspective of the global north, but it should concern the entire environment within which we live, physical, social, psychological, spiritual, that should allow the flourishing of human communities and human beings. As I argue, we need to see clearly. We need to think clearly so as to agree on what our problems are not. The first generation of African scholars assigned themselves to the task of operating a paradigm shift because they could not overcome the evils of colonialism unless they proved how inherently flawed the system was. And I think, if I can say this, one of ASA's, African Studies Association of Africa's success stories is its shift of the locus of knowledge production back to the African continent. Being an intellectual for us today ought to mean that this generation should also fight its own battles the way the early generations fought their own battles. We ought to liberate the truth. And because it is difficult to draw a line between being an intellectual and being a leader, at least for the first generation of Africanists and African scholars, it is legitimate to question today whether we have fallen into the neoliberal trap of commodifying everything, including knowledge, including leadership, including diplomas and degrees that we earn. Considering ecological externalities as a moral debt that must be paid emphasizes the harm inflicted under the guise of pursuing selfish interests in the name of the greater good of communities. The proposed development models that the West has spoon-fed on Africa are the ones that continue to harm the environment, and as I said, not only physical, but also psychological, economic, political, and so on and so forth. So my reference, when I talk about humanity stewardship, in the second part of my presentation this afternoon, seeks to remind us that unless petty financial interests lead to neglect, African studies cannot disregard the horrific events occurring globally. Sudan is in the radar. The Democratic Republic of Congo that I've already mentioned, but also what is going on in Palestine. How many African scholars are looking at this as something morally unacceptable? In my view, the success of the neoliberalism of today depends on the premises that money dominates every measurement of value. Nonetheless, although wealth creation is necessary, I believe it does not define humanity's intrinsic value. Conversely, there are intangible aspects such as remembering someone who said, falling in love, that money cannot buy, money cannot purchase. Falling in love reveals the true humanity, but at the same time, another kind of human vulnerability. As a wise individual once stated, nothing is more practical really in life than falling in love in a quiet, absolute, and final way. And he goes on to say, because what you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will determine what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning, how you spend your evenings, what you read, whom you know, what breaks your heart, and what fills you with joy and gratitude. That money cannot buy. However, cultivating this profound and humanizing way of being vulnerable to others, meaning taking care of their humanity is becoming another increasingly challenging as the accumulation of wealth and possession inhibits our ability to engage in life in a genuinely human manner. I mentioned my home country as one of the case studies or an illustration where social thickness, meaning the reputation that people want to earn in society, will depend very much on how fat their bank account is. And many of us scholars are ready to sell our brains and our intelligence to work for these wealthy people without questioning how in the first place they became this much wealthy. I know, for those at least who know the life story of V.Y. Mudimbe in the early 80s, just like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, by the way, whom I mentioned at the beginning, they had to live their entire lives in exile, far away from their home countries, because they refused to compromise the intelligence, the academic calling with the work of politicians and the money that it can procure. So the problem with existing measurements of what makes a human being, the values that we've been using, the intellectual commitment, in my view, pertains to the education of minds that subsequently become architects of our social structures and the infrastructure supporting human interaction and relationships. I mean, we need to train our minds. And the moment we train our minds well enough, then we can begin to act on the structures that we inherited from the past to make them work for the betterment of humanity. This commitment as scholars should inform our understanding of the life world and the life events. I associate really personally my transition, as I was saying, to a hermeneutic approach, not only with the work or scholarship of V.Y. Mudimbe in the invention of Africa, the idea of Africa, the fault lines, which he published shortly, it's been like 10 years now, but also with engaging with the scholarship produced by this Irish Jesuit that I mentioned, whose scholarly work aims to elucidate the role of human consciousness in shaping scientific objects. Heelan's research facilitates dialogue between rigorous science, particularly the work of theoretical physicists like Eugen Wigner, Werner Heisenberg, John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, and philosophy. Patrick Heelan, the Jesuit I mentioned, emphasizes the influence of Bernard Lonergan, another Jesuit, Canadian Jesuit, in his methodological approach in theology, as well as the phenomenological insight from someone like Edmond Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty on perception. What do we see? Why do we see what we see and not everything else? So in his effort to comprehend how the human consciousness functions, but also how it interprets social realities. In a compelling paper on the paradoxes of measurement, and this is what I wanted to emphasize here, Patrick Heelan contends that scientists, in their pursuit of truth, are human beings influenced by their contextual environments. Indeed, any scholarly work begins with the definition of the scientific object or phenomenon to be measured, which constitute the primary focus of observation and analysis within the academic inquiry. So it is crucial to acknowledge the significant distinction between two forms of representation involved in the study of any given phenomenon. The perceptual object, situated within the domain of the lived world, what Germans would call the Dasein, the social interactions, the history, the cultural background, and conversely, its theoretical model or representation, which unfortunately some of us in the sciences want to extrapolate and give a universal meaning or value. It is this mathematical reflection or constructed to accurately mirror the ideal structure of the perceptual object that we need to challenge, and that was imposed maybe by those who came to colonize Africa and tried to force Africa within a Western way of inhabiting the world. Typically, scientists, scholars, and analysts use the same scientific terminology for both what we call the phenomenon, but also with its theoretical counterpart or representation. And this practice may engender confusion as it elevates the likelihood of misrepresentation between different systems of meaning. And this I owe to Patrick Hillan, who gave me the example when explaining, for instance, you hear the sentence, number 10 Downing Street, just that. What is the information contained in that piece of a sentence? It could denote the 10th residence in a numerical sequence of numbering houses on Downing Street, located elsewhere, and therefore does not adequately convey the essential information. For a mailman, someone who is simply delivering the mail, he will count the numbers, and at 10 Downing Street, just leave the mail. But in a different context or system of thought, 10 Downing Street refers to the most powerful place or locus of power in England. And so just that, the house of the British Prime Minister, will show you that one sentence can cover different meanings depending on the context, depending on what one is trying to convey as a message. I will move on to the next point and apply some of these just theoretical allusion or allegories to what I've been observing in my home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for the past 30 years. A cycle of harmful policies, a recycling of ineffective leadership, a cooptation of politicians lacking knowledge, driven by power and profit, and never for the good of the people that they are supposed to be in charge of. I can say that since childhood, I have seen also the paradox of wealthy nations and poor populations, rich resources, but extreme poverty in my home country. Will this paradox ever change without challenging the basis upon which it is built, the colonial legacies that we perpetuate maybe when we approach that phenomenon or the reality? To paraphrase, many theories have tried to explain this, but none addresses the core issues. It is now common to blame Africans for African failures. But to paraphrase Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whom I had the privilege of serving as an interpreter with Professor Cecilia Lynch, we accept to normalize the abnormalities, the anomalies. Most of us spend our initial hours, for instance, when we got to Cabo Verde, lamenting the travel difficulties within the African continent and somehow comforting each other. Many couldn't join us due to transit visa issues, which countries treat travelers like criminals while tolerating foreign corporate crimes. Airlines canceled flights without repercussions. Travelers returned to their home without reaching the destinations that they were trying to travel to. But for us, everything is seen in Africa somehow as a privilege and never as a right. And so we need to begin challenging some of these realities. When will we reclaim, or begin at least to reclaim, what is owed to us, what is due to us? Maybe our lands, maybe our humanity, maybe our own privileges, but the ones that we define by ourselves. So these questions deserve serious attention and should not be dismissed lightly. In a decade or two, I am sure my generation may find itself marginalized due to age, but at the same time, it will have outsourced all our problems to the next generation if we do not attempt everything we can today to resolve our problems. Our current scholarship, I want to say, seems to contrast with the scholarship of our forefathers in Africa. In the 50s, in the 40s, in the 60s, any intellectual on the African continent knew that he had to be, or she had to be, also an activist, because knowledge acquisition was to the service, or for the service of the community. So our current scholarship contrasts with the past sacrifices of our elders who fought for dignity, sovereignty, and independence. Our task today is to promote that humanity stewardship that acknowledge Africa's and African life's value, in contrast to the one that has been pushed on us by the colonial library. We have to exhume and resuscitate those values from the Ubuntu, emphasizing that uplifting others, humanity, is the only way for me or for us to survive the crisis and the challenges of today. It is also to recognize that we cannot continue to blame, of course, modern situation of Africa on outside actors the moment we have learned, as Sheikh Anta Diop, Sheikh Amidou Kane put it in his powerful novel, The Ambiguous Adventure. I will pass some text for the sake of time and ask what is next. I believe actually that, as I mentioned, the Ubuntu cosmic vital order we aim to build or rebuild requires shifting away from the current dominant ways of thinking and African consciousness. It means reappropriating the values that have been buried by adopting a system of value that privileges material wealth over spiritual encounters. Solution to global issues can't come from using crisis language or a sense of helplessness only. We need a message of hope, or we need a hopeful approach that looks beyond struggles to what we can see as possibilities. Some focus on Africa's shortcomings and become blindly optimistic, while others claim to be balanced but overlook their assumptions. It is useful to see vulnerabilities as phases toward well-being, aligned with what Placide Temple's Afro-African vitalism defined and distinguished in the 40s and the 50s. So this perspective views Africa through a utopian lens, emphasizing resources, promising trends, and challenges that require clarity. Over the next 10 years, Africa can transform its vulnerabilities into opportunities by reclaiming its creative power, its ingenuity, and especially the African youth, thus fostering greater interconnectedness and tapping into the resources available. We shift, therefore, the question, not what Africa suffers from, but rather what it will become in the coming decades. Through our creative actions, through our paradigm shift, how do we want Africa to look like, say, in 2045, 20 years from today? Of course, in terms of demographics, we can make projections in terms of energy, but also in other aspects. We know that the African Union has established an agenda that embodies both the dream of the founding fathers of independence and anticipates the aspiration of their successors. But the dichotomy sometimes is too strong. And we were discussing this morning how our leadership today seems to live in complete disconnect with their communities. I believe, for my part, that dependency is Africa's most demanding vulnerability today. This continent produces goods that its people rarely consume and relies completely on other nations for the essential. We had a workshop yesterday on soil, water, and food sustainability on the African continent. And this morning we discussed again some of these issues. Why should we produce food that we do not eat and eat food that we do not produce? I believe this rentier economy has long focused on criticism, with self-sufficiency often suggested as solution. Today, we continue to hear the same rhetoric about decoupling and resilience, yet no real action follows. So 50 years ago, the Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop called for industrialization of Africa, industrializing Africa. Others propose education as the key to transforming the continent through knowledge and skills. But we know that Asian countries did just that. They did not preach, they acted, leveraging technology and science to become developed nations. In contrast, Africa's education system remains a factory for creating vulnerable minds and useless and jobless people. While raw material exports persist, we also promote an economy rooted in processing, innovation, and knowledge. We endlessly discuss Pan-Africanism for the youth, but the continent stays divided along European linguistic lines, Anglophone versus Francophones, Lusophones versus Spanish-speaking, etc. Our school curricula still carry Western influence, and universities adopt, at least in my home country, we've been in the process of updating the university programs to what we call the LMD system, Bachelor, Master's, Doctorate, as a sign of intellectual subservience. Not the content is changing, cosmetic changes only are being pursued. Thanks to oil, the United Arab Emirates transformed arid Bedouin lands into a futuristic hub of prosperity. Meanwhile, all rich African nations, which are similarly wealthy in resources, are plagued by conflict, terrorism, and corruption. Africa says it needs engineers, it needs data analysts, researchers, yet no one invests in higher education with the same commitment seen in emerging Asian countries. This is yet another paradox that exposes the greatest vulnerability of our policies, our politics, our countries, our nations, but also humanity's capacity for reasoning. So this idea has long been and mistakenly attributed to the West, relegating Africa to the margins of primitive emotionalism, a subordinate position, and an overemphasis on its irrationality. This is the legacy of colonial anthropology, a system skillfully deconstructed by a Congolese thinker whom I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, V.Y. Mudimbe, as he analyzes the colonial library. The goal is not to revive this view by citing different African discourse on rationality or a unique form of African political disorder. Instead, it concerns a theoretical process of knowledge in Africa that hold the same validity as epistemologies from the North. Deconstruction frees, and reconstruction restores the African, reclaiming their humanity and rightful place as bearers of ancestral wisdom. For example, the concept of North versus South, global North versus global South, is another social construct, because we know that the equator, which divides the world or the globe into two, places some African countries such as Chad, Senegal, and Ghana in the northern hemisphere on the map. Greenland appears larger than Africa, while the African continent is actually 15 times larger. Cameroon is the same size as Switzerland, yet it is 11.5 times larger. Many other examples of mental colonization call for a deconstruction of this mindset, and even more so for the rehabilitation of humanity immune to false vulnerabilities. So the contemporary world is not a haven of peace for states in harmony with one another. We are experiencing a clash of civilization and mutual ignorance. The realism on which interstate relations are based is underpinned by a bellicose metaphysics. In this view, humanity is inherently prone to conflict, and states exist solely to defend their conflicting interests. The mindset that frames this epistemological constructivism is dualism of deadly confrontation. We are not seeking to replace it with a superficial consensus based on current events, nor with a holism that stands in stark contrast to capitalist individualism. Rather, we must start from its core African humanism, Ubuntu, as an ethic of relationships, a metaphysics of alliance, and a pedagogy that awakens people to transcendence and to the identity of a strong, capable human being. We are not seeking to become disciples of Asian religious founders. We are learning to be human through the ancestral wisdom that can stem the tide of entropy. The spirituality that forges people of value is an African solution to global vulnerabilities. The sacred grove has not burned yet, said Bimwenyi, a Congolese philosopher. The African still carries within them fragments of these values and cherishes dreams of a more humane world. In this world, battleground of meaning, the strongest dominate and they set the rules of the game. To balkanize Africa cannot move forward unless Africans forget that they are one and they belong to one nation. Celebrating the benefit of Pan-Africanism may not be enough, but it is time to move toward more practical policies of integration. Why not dream of a monetary integration? Why not dream of the United States of Africa, but not an empty shell, enhanced by economic cooperation, suppression of these visa and borders that are artificial, through something like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCAT? Why can't we think of a serious collective security for Africa, an African central bank, a common passport, and if you will, even a spiritual Pan-Africanism? Because there is no Pan-Africanism when one country invades another, as I mentioned about what is happening in the Congo. There is no Ubuntu when xenophobia undermines peaceful coexistence on the continent. There is no future for the continent when ancestral wisdom cannot transmit to younger generation the knowledge of a difference that enriches humanity. As we can see, another continental vulnerability lies in the rigidities of these artificial borders, imaginary or real, which persist even as the melodies of liberating Pan-Africanism resound everywhere. In conclusion, I would like to say that we are aware of the actions that must be undertaken. We cannot simply sit around and enumerate all the vices, all the fragilities and vulnerabilities. I believe the difficulty lies in identifying the most appropriate method to execute existing solutions. We can substitute the act of denying our humanity with the affirmation of our human dignity. And we know that some elders did this with the negritude movement. And rather than adhering to a predetermined destiny, we can endorse a future selected by free will. May this gathering here serve as a period, a moment of real enlightenment in exploration, revitalizing hope for the creation of a shared future. Our concluding remarks are addressed to the youth of the African continent. We exist within an era marked by unprecedented changes. The notion of truth is increasingly being scrutinized. The importance of fundamental principles is under challenge, although their significance remains acknowledged. Instant gratification is often preferred over enduring values. The logic of pragmatism tends to override genuine commitment. Opportunism tends to displace principled morality. In this environment of almost nihilistic despair, some advocate a reversion to African wisdom, emphasizing solidarity and authentic humanism. It is important, and it is toward this African humanism, founded on inherent dignity of every individual, that we must direct our guidance and empower our African youth, while also addressing the global vulnerabilities that obstruct their future. Thank you so very much for your attention. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Toussaint. Il n'y a rien à ajouter. And thank you, colleagues, for staying on, holding on, and thank you for, really taking your time, to address really pertinent issues that we should be thinking about, going forward, and addressing the continent, affecting the continent, and also the global community. It's been a long day, and we really appreciate your time, your efforts, but also many of the people who've made this possible, colleagues who are running up and down and who seem to be invisible, and oftentimes we approach them because we have problems, but we want to celebrate them for many of the things that are going very well. So we don't just focus on blaming them for many of the issues. So thank you to all the volunteers, all the colleagues, all the technicians, the ASA team, people who are very exhausted now, and then Richard, there are lots of yes, I do. Richard is not here. Clementina on that side. Thank you, people. It's been a beautiful day. Long journey. But there are a few announcements. The film program has been moved to tomorrow and also Friday, distributed across the day from morning till afternoon along the parallel sessions. So we've just downloaded the program. There is somebody you don't see here, Richard, who is working deep. Oh, he's right there. So everybody who is complaining about something on the program, Richard is very tired. So he's been working on it. So you're going to have a new program by morning because we have to rest and wake up again to work. But 2 headsets are missing, translation or interpret. My God, 12. Oof, that's a lot. 12 headsets are missing. So please, if you're keeping a headset and you thought it's a gift, oh, okay. There is one, we just found one. Yeah, that's sorry. 11, so we found one, so 11 are missing. If you have a headset, please just hand them over so that technicians can count them. And then registration will continue tomorrow, please. And I've been told that you should, if you're doing the dinner, the gala on Friday, you should also pay tomorrow. But tomorrow we're starting at 8:30. And please, I know we're very tired, but let's try to be prompt. Sorry? Yes, that's come last, but we're starting at 8:30, so let's try to be prompt so that we don't have to push the program very late. It's not just for us who are tired and thinking, but also there are people who left their families very early in the morning and they need to go back to their families. And so it's really important we respect that. There are many of the technicians and other people. So there is an exhibition, not just exhibition, but also it's like a mini market in the media center just by the restaurant. If you haven't been there, please go there. Lots of people coming from different communities, to expose their stuff. So please pass by that place. Otherwise, we will see you tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Proms, thank you for today. Okay, have a good evening. Yeah, thank you.